All right, we're going to talk a little bit about sculpting basics. All right, so the basics of sculpting in Mudbox are actually pretty straightforward. The first thing we've got to do is actually click on one of the tools when we first launch Mudbox in order for it to bring up the properties for that tool. So when we're looking at the properties for the tool, we have things like size and strength. Now, those can also be changed interactively in my viewports by using the bracket keys to change the size. And then right below the bracket keys, we have the quote and semicolon keys, which increase and decrease the strength. Now, I can also do the brush size a little bit differently by holding down the B and dragging left to right. Then I can use M and dragging left to right to increase or decrease the magnitude or strength of the brush. So a couple different ways to actually work. Now, with the sculpt tool by itself, without any kind of stamp or stencil involved, when I drag over the mesh, I'm basically just pushing out the mesh based on that size and strength. So if I decrease the size of my brush and go to drag across the mesh, this mesh, I'm going to get some pretty kind of messy results for right now. So let's hit Control Z to undo. And then we're going to hold down Shift and hit the D key. Shift D subdivides the mesh, and you can see up there at the top, it shows me that there's a new subdivision level. So we hit that again, we're now at about 98,000 polygons. So as I drag over, I'm going to get a little bit better result. Now, one thing that's also going on, I'm getting a little bit of roughness to that, basically because with this size brush, the magnitude or strength is a little too high. So we're going to bring that back down, and now when I sculpt, I see I have a little bit better result. Now, oftentimes, it's really a good idea to get in the habit of using the smooth brush, which is number 2 on the keyboard, and just kind of going over those strokes just a little bit to soften up and smooth those edges out. Now, as you can see, if I smooth too much, I can pretty much obliterate or erase all of that detail entirely. So we need to be careful again with the strength of that brush. So I'm going to bring the strength of my smooth brush down, and as I brush around that edge, I'm just going to kind of smooth it out a little bit. So I don't want to get rid of it, I just want to soften it up a little bit and get rid of some of that kind of chunky detail. Alright, so some of the other tools we have are things like grab, where I can grab part of the mesh and just pull it out. Now, it's not actually creating any new mesh. All it's doing is taking the existing mesh and pulling it around. So as you can see there, we can definitely get some, odd results. So what we want to do, we're going to undo that. And we're going to go back and we're going to change the size of that brush a little bit. So we're pulling a little bit more of the geometry when we do that. So now as I pull, since I'm getting more of the geometry, I'm going to have a little bit better result. Now it's always going to pull in the direction of my brush. So I've got to move around my viewport in order to actually get that to go the direction I want it to. So then from there, if we have to, again, we can subdivide to create more mesh on there. Alright, so as we move around our mesh and take a look at it, the more we subdivide it, obviously, the smoother the mesh gets. So I can look at using some of my other tools here to start to look at tightening up those edges so we can sharpen or pinch those smooth edges into much harder creases. So again, the pinch brush has its own settings as well. So if I crank up the strength on the pinch brush, it's going to pinch and crease a whole lot more quickly. Now we can look at maybe flatten, so we can decrease the size of our brush. Maybe we want to flatten off the top of that stroke. So the way flatten works, it's going to look at basically an average of the faces in order to figure out where you want to flatten the object. So as we move around, we can actually get some pretty nice kind of hard surface sculpting. And then we can go back to our flatten and we can make sure that this area around there has been flattened nicely back into the mesh. And once we get pretty good average here, we'll go back to our smooth brush. Maybe increase the size of the brush a little bit, and we can smooth that out. So we can ease that transition back in. So as we continue to look at different tools here, the foamy brush is going to do some pretty cool stuff where it just kind of makes blobs underneath the brush. So we get kind of a foamy look to it. Now you can do pretty similar stuff just using the sculpt tool, but you're going to get some pretty cool options. Now the spray brush automatically uses a stamp image and turns on randomize. So as I stroke across the surface, it's basically just spraying this pattern onto the surface of my object. Repeat is going to do what it says. As I stroke across there, it's repeating this stroke. Now, if I look down here into my properties, for this, let's undo that. And I'm going to increase the stamp spacing. So as I increase the stamp spacing, you'll see it spreads it out a whole lot farther. Let's look at increasing that stamp spacing even more. So as I stroke, I now have quite a bit more distance in there. Let's increase that all the way to 100. So at 100, it's basically taking this entire object and it's going to skip the entire brush before it makes a new shape. So as we decrease the stamp spacing, we're going to end up having a brush that looks almost the same as just the sculpt brush. So it's a nice way that you can make basically small details or repeating patterns on an object. And the nice thing is it's also going to follow the curvature of my brush. As I change direction, it's going to change the direction of that stroke as well. All right, Imprint's going to do something pretty cool here. Imprint's going to take this stamp image and allow me to scale it over the surface. So as I click to define where I want the center of the pattern to be and then drag, I define how large it's going to be. And then when I drop the brush, it basically imprints that shape onto the surface. You can do some pretty cool stuff with the imprint brush. So as you can see there, it breaks the shape across the surface of other strokes. So I can use that basically as kind of a secondary tool to add detail over the top of a mesh. So we can smooth stuff back in, so we get some kind of background detail, and then we can go back to our imprint brush, maybe decrease the strength a little bit. And then as we drag across there, it's not going to be quite so pronounced, but we're going to be able to kind of pile it up and end up adding what appears to be a lot more detail across that surface. Wax is going to try to fill in around objects. So it's going to try to fill in those gaps in between spaces. So let's decrease the strength of that quite a bit. And then we're going to decrease the brush size also. So now it's going to basically just try to fill in up to the uppermost level of that stroke. So it's just going to keep filling in. Scrape is kind of the opposite, where it's going to start to dig into the surface. So I'm pulling material back off. Now scrape is going to try to just basically get down to the original level of the object. But I can basically just keep flattening things out. But it'll leave the gaps. So anything that's kind of pushed into the mesh, it's going to leave there, and it's just going to try to scrape the raised surfaces back down. Fill is a little bit like wax, where it's just going to try to fill in between areas of the mesh. Knife allows me to, let's get a smaller brush here, carve into the surface. Now, that's kind of cool. I don't personally use the knife tool a whole lot because with the sculpt tool, if I hold down control, I basically have the ability to also carve into the surface. Now, the sculpt tool is going to be more based on the size of the brush, and the knife tool is going to try to keep it very, very tight and narrow. But again, with the knife tool, if I hold on control, I get the opposite direction for the stroke. So the knife tool does definitely have some purposes. Smear, just like the name implies, allows me to kind of push the mesh around and smear those strokes. So it's kind of like the smudge tool in Photoshop. Bulge does just that. It starts to bulge the mesh out. So as you can see, areas of the mesh like this that have quite a bit of detail already. As I go to bulge them, I'm going to have some pretty bizarre results. We can always go back to the smooth tool and start to kind of bring that back under control. So we can get rid of some of those crazy details that have been pushed just too far. So if you ever feel like you've basically pushed the mesh too far, either hit undo immediately, Control Z, or just grab your smooth brush and start pushing back over the top, and you can relax all those details back into the mesh and get rid of basically how the mesh can fold across itself. Now, if we want to keep some of the sharpness to those details, we then go back to pinch and we can sharpen up those transitions and get some kind of new, good, pointy, hard edges. Amplify, just like it says, is going to help me to amplify those details on the mesh. So you can see the strength on this has got to be cranked up pretty high for it to work really quickly. But you can see as I'm brushing over this area of the mesh here, those small details are definitely getting bigger and stronger. Now, it's not just amplifying the ups, it's also pushing the parts down into the mesh a little bit more. So it's amplifying everything, both up and down into the mesh. Freeze allows me to basically paint over an area of the mesh that I don't want to touch. So once I've frozen this area of the mesh, we're going to go back to that imprint tool and we'll drag that back over. So now as I drop that right in the frozen area, nothing changes. So I drag it across the frozen area. You'll see that it does imprint into the unfrozen part of the mesh, but it doesn't touch the frozen part. So it's a nice way to be able to protect areas of the mesh. So freeze and mask are actually pretty similar, but mask allows me to work on layers, where freeze is basically for the entire object. Erase, so I can erase areas of a sculpt layer, which I don't have right now. So freeze, again, if I hit Control, I can unfreeze the areas that have been frozen. So Control basically is the way to work in the opposite direction that the brush would normally work. Alright, so that's it for the basics of all the sculpting tools. Now, remember, in the long run, there's really no substitute for experimentation.